Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Kyle with Brickto Security, and today we're continuing on the Hack the Box starting point series with the bike box. Let's get going. Alright, so I got a box up and running here. I'm going to grab our IP address, hop in Kali and do a sudo nmap, put in our IP to -sv to get version numbers, -sc to do a default script search. I'm going to let that run. I'll go back to you in a sec. So we got two ports up and running. We got the port 22 with SSH and port 80 with HTTP. And we also are told that this has Node.js or Node JavaScript. So I'm going to open up our Firefox and I'm going to paste in our web address. And it pulls up a web page that says they're down and under construction, but we can submit an email. So let's take a look at Wappalizer, open that up, and we can confirm that I did find a programming language of Node.js. Now what Node.js is a template that programmers can use to put onto their web page if they need to collect user data or something of the sorts. So instead of having functions being called over and over again for each individual field, they can just upload a template that Node.js is able to provide and then just collect all the user data just from parameters. So it just makes their job a little bit easier. Think of just like a contact sheet. So instead of having to have each one of those functions aligned, they'll just throw up a template that can use those parameters to collect everything and send it back to the server on their side. So what I'm going to do next is type in an email here just to make sure that we don't get any errors. It doesn't really matter what we type here, just confirm that we are able to actually submit an email and we don't get any errors. It just says we'll be in contact. So we're not going to do any kind of user enumeration and be able to possibly find something for SSH, but we can see what we can work with on this because we know we have some kind of template. So I'm going to hop over to Hack the Box right now. Let's answer some of the starting questions and we can get a look into see what we need to do moving forward. What TCP ports does nmap identify as open? That was port 22 for SSH and then port 80. What software is running the service listening on the HTTP web port identified in the first question? That was Node.js. What is the name of the web framework according to Wappalizer? Let's go back in, take a look at Wappalizer. We can see that the web framework is Express. What is the name of the vulnerability we test by submitting 7x7? Now we can do a Google search of what this 7x7 exploit is going to be. And what's going to come up for you is going to be what's called server-side template injection. So what I alluded to before was Node.js was our template that we are going to look to exploit. And what we can do is load a page and look for something like server-side template injection payloads. And we'll get a whole bunch of everything that comes up, but we can often default to something like Hacktricks. Hacktricks is just a great website that gives you good methodology, coding, and explanations to moving forward in your pen testing career. And we can scroll down and we can get the explanations as to what it is. The first step is going to be to detect, identify what specific template we're using, and exploit based upon what we're getting back from our feedback on our response pages. And it gives us what looks like are similar to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, but we can grab all of these payloads and submit that out to our template. So I'm just going to grab the first one. Let's go back to our web page, paste that in. And the very first one we get, we're going to get our error page. And an error page is not necessarily a bad thing when you're a pen tester. It's often gives you a look underneath the hood as to what could possibly be the issue. Think of seeing a check engine light come on with a car. You know that there may be something wrong and it's something that you should look to explore a little bit more. And all the different lights in the car, such as like a low air tire pressure or oil needs change, all those different indicators are what's going to give us a better foothold in the environment. And the first thing that I want to point out is under all of these parsers, it is referencing where we are, being the root on the back end, has our node modules, and specifically the module that is being used is called handlebars. So we know the handlebars module is being used. So let's go back into Hacktricks and we can look for a specific module being handlebars. And down here, it gives us a payload that we can use. You can check out this documentation here that kind of goes into a further explanation as to specifically why this works the way it does. But the thing that we want here is just the payload. So what I'm going to do is grab this payload, and we need to find a way to submit this into our web page. And what I'm going to do is actually load up Burpsuite. So I'm going to open another tab, and I'm going to load up Burpsuite. We just need to open up a temporary project. We can use all the default. And now I'm going to get our page into Burpsuite. And the first thing that I'm going to do is actually set up something called Foxy Proxy for you. So if we go into Firefox again, we can Google Foxy Proxy. And on the second one, there's the Mozilla. Since we're using Firefox here, you can go ahead and install this. I've already got this installed, but you'll have a proxy that you can use over here. If we load up our options, we can set up new. So we can add a new one. We can title this burp, and you can set up your proxy. You're going to keep it as an HTTP, and then you need to set up your proxy IP address. And we're going to set this to 127.0.0.1. All this is your loopback feed. So every time you enter something into a web page, it's going to loop back and request something back into your page. And our port's going to be 8080. And then you're going to click save on that. I'm going to click cancel because I already have this set up, and it's going to just be labeled as burp. So now if I turn on the burp page and I go back into our page here, I'm going to click back, and we have this payload that we know that we're going to submit. I'm going to press submit one more time just so it reloads the page. Now if I go into burp and I click on proxy, we can look at our HTTP history and we can see the specific requests that we had here. And we can note that it has our request that we have. We entered our email, which was our payload being the 7x7. And then we have the response, which is that error page that we were looking at before. But this request page is what we're going to be using to exploit. So I'm going to send this over to Repeater. We need to try different payloads so we can enumerate the website further and see if we can get any kind of response back from the server that might give us further privileges. And so we know we need to enter our payload into this email section here. So going back, I can grab this payload that we had specifically, but if you notice at the bottom here, it has URL encoded. And why that is important is going back into Burpsuite, we can see that we have the %7, B %, and so on and so forth. This is a URL encoding of special characters being like the parentheses, so that the web page can actually recognize that and send that back to the server. So what I can't do is go into here and then paste in our payload, because the website's not going to recognize that, because all those characters are not going to be specially recognized characters, as well as we may actually be getting blocked, and it could lead to us getting caught as the hacker. So Control-Z just to reset that the way it was, and we're going to go into something called the decoder tab here in the Burpsuite. So I'm going to paste our payload in here at the top of the decoder, and now I'm going to do encode as and then URL. So we can grab this here at the bottom, doing Control-A, and then copy this over, go back over to our repeater, and I'm going to paste that into our email address right here. And so now we can see that instead of having those gaps and spaces and parentheses and everything, it actually recognizes our payload as it's highlighted here and puts it all into URL encoding. So now when I click send, we get an error page again. If we take a look at our response here, we can see our reference error being require is not defined. So let's go back in. Let's take a look at our payload that we have submitted, and we can see that this line right here, this push, says return require, and then the child process.exec who am I. Now why this isn't working is a coding issue that comes from require not being defined as a global variable. Global variables are something that every function can call to that is being defined within the entire source code project. But because require is not actually defined, we can assume that it's not going to be available to us as a global variable. Now, after doing some research here, I found a web page that may be helpful to us in the Node.js documentation. I'm going to turn off our proxy because we don't need to send anything over to Burp right now. And I'm going to paste this documentation in for you. This documentation defines global objects, and it says these objects are all available in all modules. The following variables may appear to be global, but are not. They exist only in the scope of modules. See the module system documentation. These objects listed here are specific to Node.js. They are built-in objects that are part of the JavaScript language itself, which are also globally accessible, which means that these are not actually global variables. We can see require right here is just a built-in object. What a built-in object is different than an actual global variable. A variable is defining something that we are expressing within the coding. But a built-in object is when you have specific functions to an already defined variable. So if you go into something like Excel and you type in add in all caps, it's going to do that function of addition. Same logic here is we have a built-in object of require, and that is going to have a specific function, and we cannot actually define that. So now that we know we can't actually use that global object, we can go back into our payload, and we know that we need to change this line right here because we cannot actually use the require variable. Now going back looking in the documentation that I found, you can scroll up and you can see all the different global objects that we can use. Now we can go and try each one of these, but the one specifically that I'm going to look at right here is going to be process. Now I'm going to go into Burpsuite, and we need to return what would be the new variable. So I'm going to return process. I'm going to have that decoded as URL. You just have to click down into the bottom box, copy that over, and let's send that back into repeater. I'm going to highlight all of our previous payload, paste that in, and press send. And we did not get an error message here. Instead, if we look at the response, we can see that it was able to call a different object. Now, if you read the documentation as to why this payload works the way it is, it's looking to call specific objects and processes. Now, this is great news for us because now we know that the process variable is a global variable that we are actually able to call. After doing some more research, I found another web page that may be good for us. I'm going to paste this into Firefox for us, and it's going to be the process documentation and everything that it's actually able to call. And there's one thing specific that I'm going to look to show you. It's going to be the process.main module. And now, although it says deprecated, it doesn't necessarily actually mean that we won't be able to call this main module. And why this is an important process for us to look at is because it is an alternative way of retrieving the require.main, meaning the main functions within the code index that's on the server side. Now, why we're looking to specifically do that is because if we go back into Burp and we take a look at the bottom, we can see that it called one specific object, but now it's trying to request an object and a process. So we're trying to give it that process that it's looking to define. I'm going to go into decoder again, and I'm going to return process.main module. Click the bottom here. I'm going to highlight all this. Now let's send this back into repeater. Paste that in and press send. And we did not get an error in our response, which is a good thing. And if I scroll down into our response, we can see that we have two objects that have now been called, which is a great thing, meaning that the main module within process was able to be called. All right, so this is great news for us. Since we are now able to actually call the object, let's go take a look at our payload again and see what the next steps are going to be. We know that we need to require, so since we have called upon the main function, we should be able to use this again, and we're going to require a child process. So what I'm going to do is actually require this child process. I'm going to copy this over, go back into Burp, go into our decoder, and now we have return our process.main module. So I'm going to add another period here because now we're going to call this new function, and I'm going to paste what we had in here. So now it's going to main module require a child process. Click on the bottom. I'm going to highlight all this. Let's send this back into repeater. Did not get an error again, and scroll back down at the bottom, and it was still able to call both functions. Now this is good news for us because now we can look to further exploit by recalling different child functions. Now this is good news for us because now we can look to call different child processes. And doing some more research, I was able to find another web page that may help us. Load this back up. The specific child process I want to look at are all these synchronous process creations. Now I'm going to show you what this is. It's the child process, and then it gives us the examples that we can use. The methods are synchronous and will block the Node.js event loop, pausing execution of any additional code until the spawn process exists. So blocking calls like this are mostly useful for simplifying general purpose scripting tasks and for simplifying the loading processing of application configuration at startup. This is important for us because we are going to try to call our command prior to it doing any kind of execution over on the server side. Now, one of the specific ones we can look to use is going to be the child process.exec_sync. The child process exec_sync allows us to enter a specific command with any kind of options that we want to add to it. Now I'm going to go into our payload again, go into decoder. We have child process.exec_sync. And then we need to call whatever command that we're looking to do. So I'm going to open up parentheses here. I'm going to put a quotation and I'm going to have it do who am I, close our quotation, close the parentheses, and then put a semicolon to close our statement. I'm going to copy that into our clipboard, throw that into repeater again, paste that in, press send, and let's see what we get. Looking down here over at our response, we have our object, our function was called, here's our object, and it gave us our command of who am I, and we are root. Now this is awesome for us because now it means that the machine that we are using is the root domain and we have full control of the system. So at this point we can do one of two things. We can set up a reverse shell that allows us to communicate via a terminal, or we can look to execute commands specifically within the URL like we are doing now. So I want to show you something. Instead of going into decoder every single time, I'm going to highlight our entire payload. And over here on the right side, it has our selected text, and that's everything that we have highlighted here. And it automatically decodes us in our URL decoding. So I'm going to click see more. I'm going to scroll down and we can see that we have the who am I that we executed over in our payload. Now, instead of doing who am I, why don't we do something like ls and then specifically in our root directory, so /root. And then if we click apply changes, it's going to automatically encode that for us, and I can click send. And if we look over on this side, instead of it saying root, it now has the listed directory and having backend, flag, and snap. So let's highlight this payload once again. I included the and sign. Let's highlight this payload again. Let's go to see more. And scroll down, and instead of it saying ls/root, why don't we cat out /root and then /flag.txt. So now we have catted out flag. Let's press apply changes. I'm going to send this again. And here is our flag right there. Now let's go back in and answer the rest of these hack the bot questions. What is the name of the vulnerability we test by submitting 7x7? That was server side template injection. What is the templating engine being used within Node.js? If you remember, that was handlebars. What is the name of the Burpsuite tab used to encode text? That is decoder. In order to send special characters in our payload in an HTTP page request, we'll encode the payload. What type of encoding do we use? This type of encoding specifically was URL. When we use a payload from Hacktricks to try to run system commands, we get an error back. What is not defined in the response error? That was our require statement because it was actually a built-in. What variable is the name of the top-level scope in Node.js? The top-level scope, like variables, is global. By exploiting this vulnerability, we get command execution as the user that the web server is running as. What is the name of that user? That was root. It means we had full control. Now we need to submit our root flag. I'm going to go in, I'm going to grab this flag, paste that in, and we have completed the bike box. Now this box was a little more difficult, but it's great because it shows everything that we're going to need to do as pen testers. We're going to need to know different languages, learn how to research, and know specifically why things are working the way they are within our payloads. This is just a glimpse as to show what we need to do in order to continue to grow and learn. Overall, you guys did amazing. I'll see you in the next one.